unrest happening in the region. Washington approved this plan, believing that it could be at best a chance to spread the revolution and at worst a diversionary operation. Washington gave Arnold express orders not to disrupt the Catholic population and to treat them as if they were liberators. The expedition was put together in a short period of time, with Washington ordering 200 flat-bottom rowboats be used to travel up the river. Then they would travel on land for 12 miles to another river that would take them to the city of Quebec. Washington and Arnold misjudged the distance to Quebec, not knowing how far it was from Boston. They thought it was 180 miles, but it was actually 350. Washington decided to send Morgan's riflemen with Arnold because he wanted to get rid of those troublemaking sharpshooters. Morgan was at first against taking orders from Arnold, feeling somewhat passed over. Washington wrote to Morgan a stern letter threatening him, but also promising him that if he did not cause trouble, he would be a candidate to climb yet a higher social strata. Arnold sent Morgan as the advance guard to find a good route for the expedition. Morgan made it up the lower Kennebec River with his boats, but they were slowly falling apart, and heavy rain made the 12-mile walking portion between rivers almost impassable. The marching turned into a slog, with the heavy rain turning into snow. Still, they pressed on. Morgan held discipline and speed with his men. He had two rules that his men must follow: no stragglers and no weapon discharges without orders to do so. At the end of the day, the men would shoot their rifles instead of slowly taking apart the weapon to get out the precious ammunition. One time during the expedition, Morgan heard a shot being fired into the air. Morgan ran over to the soldier and then threatened to beat him with his stick till he confessed that he was the one that made the shot. By November 2nd, they reached their objective with only one man dying during the voyage. All the supplies they brought were lost to the cold mud and water. All they had was the items they brought on their backs. Morgan, who was suffering the same starvation and exhaustion as his men, went to each campfire, cracking jokes, and tried to keep his men in good spirits. They made it to the Quebec plains that were now covered in mud and snow, with most of the men not even having shoes or hats. But still, they made it. Arnold ordered that the trees be cut down and made into ladders to storm the city walls, and he wanted to prepare for a swift assault. He also sent scouts into the city to figure out the size of the garrison. At first, Arnold's small force arrived undetected, but one of Arnold's scouts got captured and revealed this information to the British. The British raised the defenses of the city and constructed barricades. Arnold had around 600 men, and the British were able to raise 1,200 defenders. Upon this news, Arnold held a council of war to discuss the situation. Arnold wanted to do a night attack on the city, which Morgan and a couple other officers agreed to, but the majority of the officers were against this, thinking it was somewhat a trap. Still, Arnold went along with the plan. On November 13th, at night, they crossed the St. Lawrence River, with Morgan leading in the first canoe. Morgan and his men were able to sneak past the British ships anchored in the center of the harbor, and they then made it to the Plains of Abraham, and even got scouts to watch the walls. It was also able to get a picket line around the city, undetected. The second wave was able to get across, undetected as well. Morgan advocated for a fast storming of the city, but no other officers agreed, believing it was a trap still. The British ships saw the third wave of canoes crossing and sounded the alarm. This forced Arnold to instead surround the city with the men he was able to get across. There was another force that invaded Canada under Montgomery, and they were able to successfully capture Montreal. Arnold decided to withdraw and regroup with Montgomery instead of following through with the attack, because they were spotted and now outnumbered. Arnold left Morgan to watch the walls of Quebec and to prevent the British from raiding their lines outside the city. The governor of Canada fled Montreal at the sight of Montgomery and sailed down the St. Lawrence to Quebec before the winter, and actually passed Arnold's men on the way. Once Montgomery and Arnold joined forces, Montgomery took command of all of Arnold's men, due to him outranking Arnold. Montgomery came to the conclusion that they did not have the proper resources or equipment to siege the city all winter. The men inside Quebec were prepared to sit tight and wait for a relief force to sail down the St. Lawrence in the spring. All they had to do was wait. Montgomery knew that the enlistments for the men would end in January. He knew that time was against him. He then decided that an all-out night attack under a cover of a blizzard would be their only option in taking the city. Montgomery planned for Arnold to lead a portion of his men north on the bank of the St. Charles River and bring sleds to carry 6-pounder cannons. Montgomery would attack with his men from the other direction, moving along the Cape Diamond on the bank of the St. Lawrence, and they were going to push to the lower part of Quebec. As Arnold and Montgomery attacked, diversionary operations would happen against the front of the city. Montgomery and Arnold, after marching to the lower town, would then regroup and push together to the upper part of Quebec. Quebec garrison assumed that during the cover of a blizzard would be the only time they could logically attack, and were somewhat aware that the Americans were in a dire situation. On December 30th, the night prior to the enlistments expiring, the ragged force of the Continentals attacked. Morgan spent the day before praying and joking with his men. Morgan's men moved up behind the sleds with Arnold. Arnold was able to get his column to the lower Quebec, but got shot in the leg by a musket volley from the city walls. Morgan was able to press his men through the barricade and get ladders up against the wall. Morgan was the first to scale the wall, but got thrown off by musket fire. Gunpowder burned his face, and he got the wind knocked out of him. But still, he got back up and pressed on, climbing up the ladder again. Morgan made it up the wall and then slipped on a cannon, falling and rolling on his side, causing great injury to his hip. Morgan lay motionless in agony as his fellow Virginians in rage followed, storming the walls. Morgan slowly got up and led his men into house-to-house fighting that followed. During one of the assaults, Morgan ordered the militia to take the front of the house, while he took the back alone. Kicking in the door, he waved his sword, ordering the French militia to surrender. They dropped their weapons and hailed Morgan as a liberator. Arnold was able to achieve the same success, with the enemy also surrendering en masse. For a brief moment, they had the initiative, and they could have stormed the city, but there were too many prisoners to guard, and the men in Arnold's column were overextended. They decided to wait for Montgomery to arrive, but he never came, and the whole Quebec garrison swung around to crush the courageous invaders. The British arrived in force and ordered the surrender of Morgan's men. Morgan refused, even when the British backed him up against the wall, aiming their guns. Morgan demanded the British come and try and take him, but Morgan's men begged him to surrender. Reluctantly, Morgan surrendered, but he didn't give his sword to the British. He saw a French priest staring at the scene in fear, went up to him and threw his sword at the French priest and went into captivity. Morgan spent the winter in a Quebec jail with his men. A couple times they planned a breakout, but nothing was attempted. British officers would frequently visit Morgan to pay their respects for his leadership in the Battle of Quebec. They would even go as far as to ask if Morgan wanted to change sides and lead a British regiment. Morgan, of course, lost his mind at the mere suggestion of changing sides. Arnold was able to escape getting captured, and unfortunately had to flee Canada with his men suffering from smallpox. Montgomery's No. 2 followed Arnold and retreated back to Maine. Morgan spent time arguing and fighting with his officers till he was released in June and sent to New York on parole. Morgan made it back to the Continental lines in early August, and Washington was happy to put him to work, sending him to Lower Virginia